Emily stood alone in the quiet kitchen of her Seattle home, feeling like the air itself had changed after Daniel left. The house no longer felt like a home but like a memory that refused to fade. Every corner reminded her of the life she thought she had, the morning coffee routines, the shared laughter, the small arguments that once seemed normal but now looked like warning signs she had ignored. Daniel had walked out 3 days ago after a long silence between them turned into the final breaking point, and even though he did not slam the door or shout, his absence felt louder than any fight they ever had. Emily had discovered the truth weeks before when she found messages on his phone that confirmed what her heart had already feared. Another woman had slowly replaced her in his attention, in his late replies, in his distant eyes. When she confronted him he did not deny it. He only admitted it in a tired voice as if it was something ordinary, something that had just happened. Instead of something that destroyed their marriage, he said it had been going on for almost a year, and that sentence stayed in Emily's mind like a wound that would not close. She did not cry in front of him that day, she simply went quiet, because something inside her broke in a way that did not allow noise anymore. After he left, the house became too big and too empty. Every sound echoed differently. Even the refrigerator hum felt like loneliness. Friends tried to reach her but she avoided calls, not because she did not care, but because she did not know how to explain that her life had collapsed while everything outside still looked normal. She stopped cooking full meals, forgot to open curtains, and measured time by the light shifting through the windows. Then one late afternoon a knock on the door interrupted her silence, and when she opened it she saw Carol, her mother-in-law, standing there holding a simple grocery bag like it was the most natural thing in the world. Emily froze because Carol was not someone who usually appeared unannounced. She was polite, reserved, and always careful with distance, especially after family gatherings where emotion stayed hidden behind smiles. Emily expected awkwardness or judgment, but instead Carol stepped forward gently and said she knew Emily had not been eating properly, and without waiting for permission she walked inside as if she already belonged there. That moment confused Emily more than anything else because she had prepared herself to be alone, not to be cared for by the mother of the man who had just destroyed her marriage. Carol moved into the kitchen and began unpacking simple food items, soup ingredients, bread, and tea, as if she was trying to rebuild something broken with small practical actions. Emily stood watching her, unsure whether to feel anger or relief, but exhaustion won over everything else, and she finally sat down at the table. That evening they shared a quiet meal, and at first the conversation stayed shallow, weather, work, small polite questions, but slowly the silence between them changed. Emily's voice cracked when she finally spoke about Daniel leaving, and Carol did not interrupt, did not defend him, she only listened with a heavy stillness in her eyes. Later, when the house grew darker and the conversation became more honest, Carol said something that stopped Emily from breathing normally. She told her that Emily was not the one who failed the marriage. That sentence carried a weight that felt both comforting and confusing because it came from Daniel's mother, the woman Emily expected to stand on his side no matter what. Emily asked why she would say that, and Carol hesitated for a long moment before reaching into her bag and pulling out an old folded letter. The paper looked worn as if it had been kept hidden for years. She placed it on the table without speaking at first, and when Emily opened it she recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. Even though it was written long before their marriage, the letter was addressed to Carol, and in it Daniel admitted something deeply personal about himself. He wrote about fear of commitment, about patterns he could not break, about a past relationship where he had already hurt someone before Emily ever met him, and most painfully he admitted that he sometimes felt incapable of staying loyal when emotions became complicated. Emily read slowly, each line making her chest tighten, because it showed her that what happened to her was not sudden. It was part of a pattern he had carried for years. When she finished reading she looked at Carol with disbelief and hurt, asking if she had known all along. Carol admitted she had, and that she had hoped marriage would change him, that time would fix what she saw as warning signs, but instead she stayed silent for too long, and that silence had consequences. The room felt heavier after that confession, not with anger alone but with shared regret. Because both women in different ways had believed in the same man and been disappointed by the same truth. That night Carol did not leave immediately. She stayed, helping clean the kitchen, making sure Emily had something warm to drink, and before she left she promised she would come back the next day, not as a judge, not as a mother defending her son, but as someone who understood loss in a way words could not fully explain. And when she finally walked out into the quiet street, Emily realized that her grief had changed shape, because she was no longer completely alone in it, even though the pain of betrayal was still fresh and sharp. There was now an unexpected presence beside it, something complicated, uncertain, but real, and that was the beginning of a connection she never saw coming, one that would slowly reshape everything she thought she understood about family, loyalty, and forgiveness. After that first night with Carol, Emily did not expect her to come back so soon, but she did. And she did not come with empty words or awkward silence, she came with small acts of care that slowly began to change the atmosphere of the house. She brought food, checked if Emily had slept, and sometimes just sat in silence without asking anything. At first Emily felt unsure about it, because it was strange to receive comfort from the mother of the man who had destroyed her marriage, but loneliness has a way of lowering defenses, and Emily slowly stopped resisting the presence. Days turned into weeks, and Carol became a steady part of her painful new routine, not as a guest, but as someone quietly sharing the weight of the situation. One evening after a long quiet day, Carol arrived earlier than usual, and there was something different in her expression, something heavier than before. She placed her bag on the table and did not immediately sit down. Emily noticed and asked if something was wrong. Carol hesitated, then said there was something she should have shared a long time ago, something that connected directly to Daniel and his past. Emily felt a strange tension in her chest because she had already learned too much about him in fragments, but she knew there was more beneath the surface. Carol finally took out another envelope, this one older and more worn than the first, and she explained that it was a letter Daniel had written years before meeting Emily, written during a time when he was still trying to understand himself. Emily opened it slowly, and what she read this time was not just regret, but fear. Daniel had written about patterns in his behavior, about emotional distance, about how he would get close to people and then pull away when things became serious. He admitted he did not fully understand why he did it, but he knew it had already hurt someone deeply in the past, someone before Emily. As she read, Emily felt a mix of confusion and pain, because it meant she had not been the first, and possibly not the last. Carol sat quietly while Emily read, not interrupting, not defending, just watching her reaction with visible regret. When Emily finally put the letter down, her voice was calm but sharp as she asked how long Carol had known. Carol answered honestly that she had known for years, but believed marriage would stabilize Daniel, that love might change him, but instead she watched history repeat itself. Emily felt anger rising, not just at Daniel, but at the silence that allowed her to enter a story that was already damaged. But underneath the anger there was something else, a strange understanding that Carol was also carrying guilt, not for what Daniel did, but for not stopping it sooner. That night their conversation became more personal. Carol finally admitted that her own marriage had not been as perfect as people thought. She had spent years ignoring emotional distance in her husband, and she saw similar patterns in Daniel but chose hope over truth. Emily listened without interrupting, and for the first time she did not see Carol as just a mother-in-law, but as a woman who had also lived through quiet disappointment. Over the next few weeks their connection deepened in an unexpected way. They were not friends in a normal sense, and not family in the traditional sense anymore, but something in between, two women connected by the same man but wounded in different ways. They cooked together sometimes, cleaned together, and even shared long silences that no longer felt uncomfortable. Emily began to notice that Carol's presence gave her stability during moments when grief became overwhelming. There were nights when Emily woke up feeling lost, and Carol would somehow be there the next morning with coffee and soft words. never forcing solutions, just presence. One rainy evening they sat by the window watching the streetlights blur through the glass, and Emily found herself laughing briefly at a small memory from her past. It surprised her because she had not laughed in weeks. Carol looked at her carefully and said it had been a long time since she saw her smile. Emily admitted it felt strange to feel even a small moment of lightness again. Carol nodded and said healing did not mean forgetting, it just meant surviving. That sentence stayed with Emily longer than expected, because it made her realize she had been stuck in the idea that pain should define her completely. Meanwhile, Daniel remained distant, occasionally sending short messages that Emily did not respond to, because she was no longer in a place where his words had control over her emotions. Still, there were moments when memory would return unexpectedly. A sound, a place, a smell, and the pain would resurface, but Carol never tried to erase it. She simply stayed present through it. As time passed, Emily started noticing something deeper in Carol's behavior. It was not just guilt or care, it was something closer to recognition, as if helping Emily was also helping her confront her own past decisions. One evening Carol finally admitted she had spent most of her life avoiding difficult truths in order to keep peace in her home, and that silence had cost her more than she ever realized. Emily listened, and for the first time felt a strange shift, because their relationship was no longer just about Daniel. It had become about two women trying to make sense of broken trust in different stages of life, and even though the pain had not disappeared, it had started to change shape, becoming less isolating, less unbearable, and more shared. And in that shared space something unexpected began to grow, not forgiveness yet, but understanding. And that was the first real step towards something neither of them had planned for. But both of them needed more than they were willing to admit. The morning Daniel returned, the air outside Emily's home felt colder than usual, and there was a strange stillness in the street, as if everything was waiting for something to happen. Emily had just finished making tea when she saw him standing near the porch, hands in his jacket pockets, looking uncertain in a way she had never seen before. He was no longer the confident man who once walked out without looking back. Instead, he looked like someone carrying the weight of all the choices he had tried to ignore. When Emily opened the door, there was a long silence between them, not angry, not loud, just heavy. Daniel finally spoke first, saying he had come to talk because he knew Carol had been spending time with Emily, and he did not like it. Emily stayed calm. Something inside her had changed over the past weeks. She no longer reacted quickly to his emotions, she simply listened. Daniel tried to explain himself, saying he made mistakes but did not deserve to lose everything, but the words felt weaker than he expected. Emily interrupted him gently and asked what exactly he thought he had lost. That question made him stop, because he realized she was no longer the same person who once waited for his explanations. She was someone who had already moved through pain and come out clearer on the other side. When he mentioned Carol, there was frustration in his voice. He said she should not have interfered, but Emily corrected him, saying Carol did not interfere, she supported someone who was left behind. Daniel fell silent again, and for the first time he had no defense ready. Emily looked at him and saw not the man she once loved, but the reality of who he had become through his choices, someone who kept repeating the same emotional distance without fully understanding the damage it caused. Daniel lowered his eyes and admitted he had made a mistake, hoping that would soften the moment. But Emily shook her head and said something simple but final, that mistakes happen once, but repeated actions become decisions. That sentence stayed between them like a line that could not be crossed again. Daniel realized then that he was not going to be able to return to the life he left behind, not because of anger, but because trust had already been replaced by understanding, and understanding had ended hope. He left without arguing further, and this time there was no dramatic exit, just quiet acceptance, as if both of them understood that chapter had closed permanently. Later that day Carol arrived as she usually did, carrying coffee and a small bag of food, but she noticed immediately that something had shifted in Emily's expression. Emily told her Daniel had come, and Carol closed her eyes briefly, not surprised but tired. as if she had been carrying the expectation of that moment for a long time. She asked if Emily was okay, and Emily nodded, saying it felt like the end of something she had already emotionally left behind. Carol sat down slowly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer uncomfortable, it was reflective. Then Carol quietly said she was sorry for everything Daniel had put Emily through, not as a mother defending her son, but as a woman acknowledging reality. Emily surprised herself by reaching across the table and holding Carol's hand, saying she did not blame her for Daniel's choices, because everyone had to live with their own decisions. That moment changed something between them. It was no longer about shared pain alone, but about mutual acceptance of what could not be changed. Over the following weeks, Emily began rebuilding her life slowly, not in dramatic steps but in small daily choices. She started going for walks again, opening windows, cooking simple meals, and responding to friends she had ignored. Carol remained part of her routine, but the relationship was no longer about rescue, it became something more balanced. Sometimes they talked about the past, sometimes about nothing important, and sometimes they simply sat together in comfortable silence. One afternoon they went for a walk near the water, and Carol mentioned how strange it was that life sometimes brought unexpected connections out of pain. Emily agreed, saying she never thought the person who would help her survive heartbreak would be the mother of the man who caused it. Carol smiled softly and said life rarely followed expectations. Months passed and the emotional intensity of the divorce slowly faded, not completely disappearing, but becoming lighter, more distant, something they could talk about without breaking. Daniel occasionally sent messages, but Emily no longer felt the need to respond, because her emotional dependence on his validation was gone. She had built something different within herself, something steadier, and she realized she did not need closure from him anymore, because she had already found it in her own acceptance. One evening, as the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, Emily and Carol sat together again in the kitchen where everything had begun. Carol looked at her and said she had never expected to find peace in a situation built from betrayal, but helping Emily had given her something she did not know she needed, a sense of honesty she had avoided for years. Emily listened and understood that healing had not only happened for her, but also for Carol in a different way. They had both changed through the same storm but in separate directions, and now they were no longer defined by Daniel or the past, but by what they had built afterward, a connection grounded not in family obligation or shared history, but in survival, understanding, and quiet respect. And as the evening light faded through the kitchen window, Emily realized that what once felt like the end of her life had quietly become the beginning of something unexpected, stable, and deeply human, where betrayal no longer held power over her, and the future, though uncertain, finally felt like it belonged to her again.